actually, I see product operations people spin up a dependency process, and what they've designed is actually going to cause premature convergence. It's going to be a badly designed game. They're going to encourage people to trump up what they want to be able to do way in advance. They're going to cause teams to get on other teams' calendars.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Product Ops Chronicles with myself, Graham Reed, my co-host and Product Ops pal, Antonia Landi. Hello, Antonia, welcome back. Today, I am super excited that we are joined by a legend in the product world, the John Cutler, head of product at Dotwork, an all-round, no-nonsense product guy. John, great to have you. Do you want to introduce yourself to probably the handful of people that don't already know who you are?
Yep, John, head of product at a place called Dotwork that no one's heard of, which is okay. And my background is mostly in B2B SaaS for a number of years. That's probably helpful context when I share different experiences. Although I did work at a company that put me out in the field, I guess, meeting lots of teams. So I have pretty good perspective around how things work in different companies and different places. And yeah, musician and dad and other stuff, but for today, that's it. I did do a product enablement role, which was kind of loosely aligned with product operations. So I'm sort of familiar with the gig.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing more about all of that today. Today, we are very much opening the studio up to hear more about John's thoughts and experiences with product operations, how this bleeds into his relatively new role at Dotwork, and the work in particular that he's been doing with prioritization, dependencies, which I know you've been very open and honest about on LinkedIn and your newsletter, which I follow for quite a while now. And, you moving kind of a little bit more into this space and your thoughts as you've kind of entered. So, yeah, John, over to you. I'd love to hear, your initial thoughts on product ops and what you feel it's all about.
Well, now it's funny because it's sort of the inception problem, because I work at a company that kind of aims to help folks in product operations, but then I'm also a product manager. And then in the past, I've also held sort of a product operations oriented role. And one thing that's become really clear to me over the last couple weeks or months, just chatting with so many product operations leaders, is that it's so easy to get pigeonholed into what we have, these 4 hats that we use at Dotwork to think about folks that we're talking to. And people can wear all the hats, and that's actually a very important detail. But there's a sort of operational, for lack of a better word, operational excellence leader hat. And this is someone sort of on the hook for the place to be excellent and to produce great results, right? And then there is what I call, and I think this is the missing link that a lot of people don't think enough about, is what I call the designer role in this, which is someone who is thinking about this as a human socio-technical problem, is thinking about how information moves in an organization, is thinking that not everything needs to be codified, but some things should be codified. And not every interaction needs to be in your face. Some things can be transactional, right? And they're sort of, these are the people who would probably write, if you were in a company that had a writing culture, these were the people that would write the sort of, here's how we work, and an introduction to the cycles and rituals and the intent behind those things. And here's how we work. And then there's this other hat we just call the builder, which is someone who's, really good at pulling tools together, will just hack away at this stuff if they need to. Suddenly you'll wake up one morning and they've rigged Coda into Tray.io and have used AI to do first versions of all the enterprise release planning notes. And it's sitting in a folder. It's actually already pushed online, and literally all marketing needs to do is make some tweaks and go, I approve, but it's already there in case someone was looking at it, right? And these people live and breathe the kind of tools ecosystem that exists for good, actually. And then there's this role who's kind of the wrangler, and it's the person that just needs to get people to do things, to fill out a form or to do whatever. And they have customers. It gets more, so all those sort of 4 hats serve the different networked group of people in your company, right? The leaders and frontline and managers and partners are pretty much the same groups to do it. So one of the big realizations actually in a lot of companies is that no one's actually supporting the operational excellence effort. It's homegrown. It's because the person, the leader in that position says, wow, we can be better at this. Like we can create a better environment here. And no one even knows who the person is kind of taking upon themselves to add that extra layer to the kind of design of the operating system, right? And then the builders are hacking away and the wranglers are doing that. But for the most part, a lot of leaders are like, well, I don't want to get involved in any of this stuff. I mean, we don't do that process stuff. Like, I'm happy when it works, but I'm not going to be there when it doesn't. Like, I'm not going to have your back when it doesn't do it. So that, long story short, you need those hats to do this well. And often product operations leaders are thrown into wearing all of those hats in not necessarily very conducive or understanding environments where people are pleased to get the results, but don't really want to know the details, right, of how you get the results to do it. And so, seeing it from the other side now has given me a fresh view into when I was in the thick of it, when I was an operator within a company, and certainly when I've been a product manager as a participant, as a customer of this whole thing. So those are some thoughts initially, but those 4 hats I think are very it's a very interesting thing. When I've chatted with people who've asked for advice, I've said, like, be really clear what hat you're wearing, and also know that if you don't have a leader who's willing to be a sponsor of the operating system you're designing and to believe in it and to preach from the rooftops that this is the right, if they are actively circumvent the design of this operating system, it's a mix of game design, service design, ecosystem design, process, whatever that design box is, if you don't have support, you get put in a very, very, very precarious position. Because when things get tough, you're not going to necessarily have people have your back on that. And so that was like a big lesson, hearing different product operations leaders talking about what's been going right and wrong. The wrong category is definitely when, you're thrown into that second designer hat and you sort of have sponsorship, but there's not real buy-in for what you're cooking up. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts about this fun wearing these. Myself, I've been jumping back and forth between these different perspectives.
That's really interesting. I really resonate with all 4 hats. I think what I see a lot when folks have trouble, especially as a sole product ops person in a company, is when they have the mandate to be the builder and the wrangler. Right? When somewhere a leader goes like, okay, this is broken, we need somebody to take care of this, but they don't have the mandate or not the explicit mandate to be that excellence person and the designer. And I think this is very interesting, right? I feel like to a certain extent, this is almost when it's 2 different kinds of product ops, right? You can just focus on doing the thing and to a certain extent enabling others to do the thing. And then, just as you said, the other side is building the system, building the ecosystem. And I often feel that it's very closely linked to service design in that way, where you're looking at the entire experience of getting work done in a company.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, not to go too much into the day job, but when we engage with customers, the first thing that we do is basically do like a service blueprint. And at the top are behaviors. There's literally what you can observe humans doing, not what we think they should be doing or whatever, but like, what are the activities? What are the actions that they're doing? And as you go down the stack, it's like the actions, the next stack are the rituals. And below the rituals are actually the documents and the artifacts. And below the documents and artifacts are the views, the sort of the information they get. And below the views are the frameworks, which are further down the stack, right? And then at the bottom of the stack are like the objects, the glossary, we do opportunities or this or whatever. And people flip that around. They say, well, I saw the slide. This is back to this designer thing. A lot of leaders are asked to present a deck that says like the here's how we work deck. But they're asked to present the super simplified version of that, where it's like, and here's a pyramid and visions on top, and here's the thing at the bottom, and here's opportunities, and we do discovery. And that's a sales piece, right? Like that's the sales piece that they use to tell executives, here's generally the operating system design. But when I talk about like this service design element below that, that's like an order of magnitude more complex. But one of the faults is that sometimes in an org, and this is a good way to think about balancing your product ops team, you need builders. Like, it is incredible when you have someone on your team who can be like, oh yeah, I just took that and I took that, and now the release notes are there, and now people don't need to hassle with it, and they can get it done. And like, you need builders. But if you don't have that missing link of someone who's being thoughtful about it, you run into trouble. It also explains another thing where I think often people listen to podcasts, or the sort of the product Instagram sphere, right? And they're listening to this, usually it's like a leader talking about ways of working. And what they realize is that, like, this is a hand-selected, very small group of companies where people actually talk about this stuff. Like, in a lot of companies, talking about how you work is considered like the work around the work. It's not even considered very valuable. Whereas in other companies, they talk about it. You'll hear in the hallway, they'll be like, well, I don't know. We don't need to centralize that decision. And we can accomplish the same outcome if we do this. And it's a very vibrant conversation internally about how you work. Other companies, not at all. And so this is another funny layer using these 4 hats, which is sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's totally implicit. You just don't talk about it. It's just how things work here. But if you're thrown into that environment in product operations, you're like, how the hell did we end up doing what we do? Like, is there any thought behind what we're doing? And it gets difficult. There's a funny story, actually. It's a company in Germany. And I was chatting with them, and, I said, well, what do you do to kind of align people? They said, well, no, we don't. Well, one thing we don't do goals. We don't have goals here at all. Oh, that's interesting. You say, yep. Me and the leadership team, we took a university course at night around sociology, based on an investor said, go and take this course. You're going to take this course at a local Northern European university to study about sociology for one, trimester or something for the year. And they said, well, we took that course and it just took us to another level. We realized that we can achieve so many of the things we need in the company without these extra things. Like, we can achieve alignment without all this theater to do these things. But the funny part, the punchline is, he said, and it's great, except every person we've hired new into the company has left after 6 to 12 months because they don't know how to function in our weird culture. Like, they leave because they're like, I can't operate in this goalless culture. But it worked for them because they had ingrained the activity. So I think that was a funny story. I love that.
I love that. Wow, I'm just so much to unpick there. I absolutely love the concept of the 4 hats, and in particular the wrangler, role, which I think is always the most difficult, because we are typically people that fall into that, leading without authority, influencing without authority. Although we tend to sit within the product or the tech division or something like that, it always sits just ever so slightly aside from the main kind of hierarchy, the org chart, which means that at its most basic level, you have to do so much more work to kind of get that, not just that buy-in, but when those arguments start, it's like, well, I want you to do this, we're going to change this, we're going to improve this, and I have had this, absolutely, where people are pushing back and say, well, I'm just going to go and talk to my boss because I don't like this. Okay, so because I don't sit within your hierarchy structure, that makes it suddenly a difficult conversation. So I'm then trying to wrangle people to do these things that have been very high level approved. There is that approval, there is absolutely that sponsorship and advocacy of product operations from on high. But actually then when you get into the detail, people are then questioning, and that becomes, just another conversation, another pushback that needs to happen. And so, yeah, that is a hat that is difficult to wear, and one that I've typically found needs an amount of professional maturity to make it goes, not age, not anything like that, but just somebody that has an amount of robustness about their personality to hear these things, coming back, continue to be professional when there is clearly, a lot of emotion that ends up being put into that pushback.
Yeah, I find that a very interesting point, right? A lot. I've worked with companies of all shapes and sizes, but something I hear a lot is that piece, right, John? Like, oh, we don't do process here. Like, process is theater. We're not concerning ourselves with work about the work. We just want to do work, right? But then suddenly, as soon as you start questioning how that work gets done, people actually care a huge amount about it. And people actually have so many opinions about how they get work done. And I find that a really, really interesting dynamic. And the question is, how do you sort of take that as a driver, as something that you can then collaborate on together, as opposed to it being a fight that's like, no, your way is categorically bad and mine is categorically better. I think on both sides even.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that, and this is why I tend to think of, I definitely think that product operations is a platform product. It's a platform or enabling product.
Yeah.
And when you put it that way and you think that different people are getting what they need out of it, right? They're getting the context out of it. They're getting your multi-sided market. It's actually a mix between a platform product and a multi-sided marketplace. So which makes it really hard. It's a multi-sided marketplace platform, which is really, really weird, right? But I think that, a couple things that come to mind. First, when you were saying, Graham, about there's some sort of agreement at a high level, that's very different than when the person's like, my expectation is that people are going to participate in this ritual, help out where product operations is asking you to help out. There are parts of this approach that we're going to let go of. Once we get going, my goal is for this to be, I'm removing this other request from you. It's subtractive change. Like I no longer, you're not just adding to their day job. And at Toast, it was funny. We had this joke about like the 40 forms problem, which is every single partner team wanted their unique spin on the information. So they spun up their own form. So product managers would say, I'm filling out 40 forms with largely the same information, but with slight differences in the particular information. And you realize, well, if people are doing that every day, your well-meaning extra request is request number 41.
Right.
Right? Like, unless you've solved that other problem, unless you've solved all the mess, unless you've kind of, one way that I tend to think about it is that, you can have highly collaborative work, highly transactional work, and somewhere in the middle, which is kind of supportive type work. And your goal in operations is to right size the approach to the type of collaboration that's required. So there's a large set of things in your company that could be transactional, but are forced to be collaborative. And there's things that should be collaborative that are forced to be transactional. So that's the mismatch that happens. And when you take that to its extension, and whenever I talk to product ops people, I say, like, what's your portfolio here? Like, and they'll say, oh, it's the ways of working and things like that. It's all this change. And the leader wants this, and they want to do operating model, and they want to do this. And I'm like, well, look, my suggestion is start with flip your portfolio. Spend 60 to 70% of your time taking the things that could be transactional and make them that could, and that are being forced to be collaborative, and make them transactional. That will free up the mental energy that you need to do the 20%, which is maybe, more around improving ways of working, and then the 10%, which are sort of vision projects for what you're doing. That could be a portfolio for product ops. But if you're, or maybe, 10%, whatever the percentages are, you have to do some central platform stuff as you're doing it. But it's just interesting to what you're saying, Antonia, which is the pushback, I think a lot of the time is just because people are completely maxed out and they don't have any mental bandwidth to even have that conversation. But then let's say you do all that and then you start to have that conversation. I think one of the things that's interesting is the difference between, kind of formalized, Scott in the book Seem Like a State, Scott has this idea of legibility, which is in bureaucratic systems, the leaders of the country or of the company will attempt to standardize things to make the organization legible to them. So that, like, you can, I want teams to all do sprints the same way, or I want all this stuff to do the same way, or I think I want everyone to do this thing. And then he has the idea of metis, which is the local organic way that people adapt working around the formal way to do creative, localized knowledge work that they're doing. So there's metis, and then there's the bureaucratic legibility. And the one thing, what your question reminded me of too, is that often product ops is not doing a good enough job exploring that tension and making a reasonable case to people, to both sides of it, the benefits of having the lightest amount of consistency and why it will benefit. That's why I mentioned platforms. Platforms are largely about like consistency and centralization of some idea distributed to people so they can do what they want. And so I think when a lot of product ops people say, well, we said it was a great idea and they did it. And often what they're not conscious about is they're falling into that kind of legibility trap. They're falling into, even in their own way, sort of expecting everyone to operate the same way. And they're not doing a good enough job to kind of to position what they're doing as like a win-win for the marketplace, if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. And I mean, firstly, love your perspective on that. That Product Ops is that platform, that enabler for teams to do their job. Absolutely, absolutely great. One of the things that I've frequently found that I've had to kind of go and do with product operations is look at this kind of idea of low-hanging fruit. It comes back to your transactional piece there, which is slightly different, but I'm kind of adding to that a little bit. Look at that low-hanging fruit. What are the simple things that we can go and solve and help those teams with? That again comes back to, we provide them with that ability to think more, to have that more brain power, that cognitive or less cognitive load, so that we can then focus on bigger items, bigger tickets that down the line. And I've not thought of it and literally until now in that way, because I've always looked at it almost more selfishly to say, look, I'm doing those things because I'm also looking to build trust. I'm looking to build trust in the teams that I'm working with. I'm looking to build trust in my leaders to kind of go, hey, product operations is providing a benefit, particularly where I work with, in 0 to 1 for product operations. So organizations have not done this, not experienced it before. So there's always that trust and that trepidation about what we're doing here. But actually, there is that side of that which says, look, actually, if we start to take many small things away from people, that is actually quite important as well, because that cognitive load, if you then add on top of that as well, the idea of context switching and the amount that you have of productivity you lose in context switching through lots of little things versus a few bigger things, it's actually quite a saving. And actually, it resonates for me absolutely, that idea of look at the smaller transactional items versus the bigger tickets and the more collaborative items that people ultimately need to do as part of their role. Antonia, any thoughts yourself on that?
So I always have a little bit of a struggle with this low-hanging fruit concept. I think so when I coach, especially product ops folks who are new to an organization, I kind of caution them. It's like, do this the first 2 months and then stop doing it, because you can get to a point where all you have on your plate is so-called low-hanging fruit that at some point doesn't meaningfully add up to a greater whole, right? And I think that's great to sort of set the tone for what you're doing, to gain that kind of trust, like you mentioned. But to me, really viewing product ops as a strategic resource at the end of the day to get the organization broadly to a better place, you need to have space for things that will take 3 months, 6 months, a year even, right? And at some point, you will need to start prioritizing the more strategic projects and make time for those. Because the thing with low-hanging fruit is there is always more, right?
Yep. One of the things, the way that I think about that is specifically you're doing that to free up the mental bandwidth to work on those types of things. That's how I kind of explain it, where, and back to the hats, right? It's kind of like what I'm thinking about is there's cases where there's just not enough mental bandwidth to even pursue. Your limiter is not necessarily your ability to spend a couple months on it. It's literally the bandwidth of the people that you're working with, their ability to process that, because they're spending so much of their time on things. You're spending a lot of their time on the transactional things. But to put a finer point on that, if you're not also thinking about the things that should be collaborative that are being forced to be transactional, that also, it's also a mismatch of time, because that actually ends up sometimes taking way more time than the opposite. So I'll give you an example. Like if someone's filling out like a form the same way every time, it is a paper cut every time they do it, but it has a kind of box in their head. They're like, okay, that's when I have to do that thing. And it's a little bit of a drag. However, if they are continuously having to go through 3 different people to figure out what the hell they're working on, that sits in your brain. So instead of bringing people together to do the work they need to do, they have to jump through 5 hops to figure out what they're going to do and go back and forth and do these things. And we can talk about it. You mentioned the dependency stuff's a great example of this. That also actually saps people's bandwidth, mental bandwidth, a lot more
Right.
than just it's like in your house. You know, I've had problems with my car that the lock on one side doesn't work. I have a 22-year-old car. And so sometimes the lock breaks on one side, but I just kind of crawl in. No one's going to steal the car. I'm crawling in the parking lot and people are like, what the hell are they doing? Now that's my workaround. That's my small like, should I go and get the lock fixed? Of course. However, the hit on that is just in the moment. Whereas if you have a murky problem, like if I'm trying to do my taxes and is this long running thing where I have to go through 5 different people to talk to the Internal Revenue Service, that literally saps all my energy for the 3 months that it takes to do it. So there's advantages. The low hanging fruit is one thing, but you should always do things that are high leverage is the way I think of low hanging fruit. But sometimes that means spending more time for even higher leverage for what you're doing. But I think that's you need the balance of both of those activities to free up people's brain to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually, Graham, not to kind of steal your job to move us on to the next topic, but I think this is such a perfect segue into stuff like dependencies, right? Prioritization, dependency mapping. Like there is so much effort being spent, usually only on a quarterly basis, right? You do it really, really painfully for one entire week every 3 months, and then you move on. But there is so much effort and so much pain being spent on specifically these 2 topics. And I think they're becoming more and more important. People are talking about them more and more at all levels, because due to the past couple of years, we are now at the point where we have to get, as an organization, better at being able to say, this has impacted these finances, doing that at that point with those users. And I think a lot of people are actually struggling to form a habit or to really operationalize this in a way that is repeatable, but it still makes sense.
Yeah, there's so much baked into the dependency thing. And one of the things that's fascinating is, well, first of all, not all dependencies are created equal. Back to that, like the different collaboration modes that you might have with someone, right? So dependencies are everywhere. Dependencies are great. I have light in my room right now because I'm dependent on the power company. That's a great dependency. I went and I got a coffee and I'm dependent on the coffee at the coffee shop. That's a great dependency to have, at least most of the time. And so one of the things that comes up is there's a couple fascinating angles of that, talking to different companies. One is, on any company that's growing rapidly, there is a strong desire to not acknowledge dependencies or formalize them or add any process around them or do anything around them, because the fear is that it slows things down, that people should just be able to work it out. Also, there's very justified fears that I see this a lot. Actually, I see product operations people spin up a dependency process, and what they've designed is actually going to cause premature convergence. It's going to be a badly designed game. They're going to encourage people to trump up what they want to be able to do way in advance. They're going to cause teams to get on other teams' calendars. They're going to cause, like, the game that they have designed is terrible. And these are good product ops people, but they're just like, well, I think I'm going to create this game, and it's actually pretty terrible to do. But anyway, so you've got the companies that are growing rapidly, and there's just a desire to just say that doesn't exist. That's what I found hilarious about the Brian Chesky thing on the Lending podcast thing, where he's like, suddenly I turned around after 4 years here at Airbnb, and it was so hard to get anything done. I mean, it was like there was dependencies everywhere. We couldn't do it. I guarantee you, from people I know at Airbnb, everyone was raising the flag about that for 4 years. Like, it's literally impossible to get anything done. But in that environment, if you were the squeaky wheel to say, hey, I need that leader and that leader to actually have a fight and decide what's more important, they would have been like, no, 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 not my business, right? So that just kind of, I'm guarantee you, it just stayed there bubbling away for years until they were getting nothing done. And then, of course, the CEO walks in and says, well, I asked you what you're working on. You listed 1,000 projects. Like, that's crazy. Well, of course, it was happening the whole freaking time while you were there. You just didn't notice it, right? And so there's this growth thing. And then the problem, though, becomes reversed. So imagine, just picture this, 10 years, there's a company growing, growing, growing. Every time they get a lot of dependencies, they hit this moment and they maybe do like layoffs and there's a little bit of a freak out, but the company's growing and growing and growing and growing. And then at a certain point, it hits this more stable amount of growth. And then someone's like, oh, we got to do dependency management stuff. We've got to do these things. And then they have the opposite problem. So the big problem, like when I come talk to a company doing SAFe or something like that, all that is institutionalized incoherence.
Right.
It's basically like, we will not resolve our dependencies. Therefore, we must have the most structured and heavyweight approach to do it. I'll tell you this, though, about SAFe. The general idea of getting people together once a quarter to work through these things, many rapid growing startups and scale ups would be very, very smart to adopt that. Now, you could design the activity a lot better. You could design it so that maybe you didn't need everyone there, maybe that quarter, or you could design it so that you made much smarter partnerships with the other teams around what were you doing. It's not a terrible idea if that's the situation, right? And so these other companies have a descaling problem, not a scaling problem. And so anyway, that's one point, is that dependencies are highly variable depending on whether you're experiencing a scaling problem, a stagnation problem, or a descaling problem. And that has a lot to do from a product ops perspective about how you should go about thinking about it. Because it is kind of true that if you formalize dependencies in a growth company, you risk not addressing the underlying problem that's causing the dependencies.
Yeah.
And you risk institutionalizing it. And you will eventually slow way down you can only get so much faster by being good at dependency coordination. You'll only eke out a little bit, a bit more to do those things. Eventually it'll catch up to you. So I have so many thoughts about dependencies, but that's like, those are some of the things. And I think that finally, what we're seeing at Dotwork too, is the companies that have like a well-designed approach to it often don't do things like map out every single dependency. Often it is much more about saying to other teams like, hey, not exactly sure what is coming down the pike on this, but we both need to be at the high collaboration mode on this.
Yeah.
Instead of like, oh, Mary's going to do 11%. And if Mark could like shift from 22% to 18%, we could get that one story, which I think will only be about 3 hours on the 17th of March. And then if we do this, we're going to do this and then do this to this. Like, they don't do any of that. It's just like general blocking based on priorities and not in the details. And like, they kick off the project together if it's a collaborative relationship. If it's not, they just kind of reserve a bit of capacity, knowing that eventually some things will bubble up. So the people who do this well take like a really smart game design approach to it versus the people who are just trying to struggle to get 1,000 people to work together, which is also hard.
Yeah, I think like it's so interesting to me because ultimately every dependency problem is really a prioritization conversation, right? But I think that scares people. And I think the uncertainty of saying, we have this opportunity, we're going to explore this opportunity. At some point, we need your input, or we might even need you to do something. But right now, we're not entirely sure what that looks like. That scares people. And then people go either one of two ways, right? So it's either just talk to each other. There's no need to codify it. There's no need to formalize it. Or swing completely the other way and say, no, we must map this in Excel, right? You need to say whether you need this team for 10, 20%, at what point, in the quarter, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm curious, Graham, what your thoughts are on it, but I have so many things about dependencies, but that's the first, like, it's very sensitive to how you're designing the game. And the argument of just work it out and like don't necessarily prematurely converge on it, of the spectrum of approaches, is actually maybe better than the extreme opposite end of the thing where you institutionalize it. The other thing that might help folks is I've come to believe that there's this magic inflection point. And here's what it is. And once this gets internalized, a lot of things become easier. Imagine you survey all the teams in your company and you ask them basically about like, what is the dependency environment for you? And it ranges from like, we're able to deliver completely autonomously whenever we want and access customers completely when we want and do whatever we want. That's like a 0 on the scale. And the far end of the scale is, we must collaborate with at least N number of other teams all the time. We are in frequent coordination meetings. Like we literally can't do anything by ourselves. So imagine you survey every team. It's a very good survey to run, actually. You get the result. Now, if the result is roughly 20% of the teams are stuck in a kind of higher dependency environment, but 80% are on the more independent end. Let's say you did a 4-point scale and 20% of them were 3-4 high, whatever you say, 3-4 high dependencies and 1-2 light dependencies. You're able to basically run an operating system that largely is aligned around independent teams, because it's the exception rule. Like, you need to be okay with exceptions and not plan a process around everything. And if it's less than 20%, you can approach that problem in a nuanced way and help those people engage. But there's this tipping point. And the tipping point, what's funny is if you're in a growth company and it moves from 20 to 40%, still leadership will not want to admit that it exists. Right? And they won't, because it's that 40, it's around 50-50 or 40-60 where people will just be like, well, we just work it out. I don't know. It's just a management problem. We just don't have the right people here. Like, oh, we just don't do these things. And they'll blame the people. They'll blame everything. However, once it goes above 50%, things will have slowed down to the point that there will be a massive crisis in the company and at least some acknowledgement of the problem on a big way. Then you'll see the leader being like, I'm going to do all the prioritization. I trusted you all to prioritize before, but you couldn't, so I have to do it now. Well, the backstory there is you've tipped over the 50-50 line on this. It's like, it's really hard to even pretend that it's the way you think it is. So once you're there, you kind of have a choice. You have a choice to institutionalize that, which is like, just pretend that this is how work is always going to be, or you have the hard problem, which is, we got to scaffold the reality right now so that people can get their work done. And we need to start making the architectural improvements and the organizational design improvements and the ways of working improvements and the operations improvements to get the percentage back up to 75 or 80% of independent teams. So that's like a tip for people. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but if all you did in product operations and said, our North Star are reasonably independent teams, that have reasonably independent and aligned teams, not just independent, because that's a problem, but independent and aligned teams doing great work. If all you did is make that your North Star and track that number and then respond with your operations approach, depending on where it came down in the thing, you'd be well off in many, many environments.
There's a piece that we've all, both of you have said kind of along the way and a subcontext here, which is that whole, we'll work it out. The teams will work it out. The idea that individuals or teams, they have a natural, almost ingrained behavior, or an assumption that they have a naturally ingrained behavior to kind of go, yeah, do you know what? We'll just kind of collaborate and it'll all work itself out.
Yeah.
And my experience is that that's just, firstly, not universal, and B, very rarely actually exists. Yeah. And it's nothing to do with ways of working per se. It's not as a result of the ways of working, it's personality. Yeah. And something Antonia's heard me say lots and lots of times, fully believe that a big part of product operations is about people. It's about people and their behaviors and how they think and ultimately adjusting and help support new embedded behaviors in them. So I'm really keen to kind of just hear a little bit more about this whole, teams will just go and work it out together, whether that's a right or wrong assumption, because as I say, in my experience, they just don't do that. They are not capable of, off their own back and almost being very unselfish, going, hey, let's just get a call together and we'll go and work it out when it happens. Nobody is perfectly aligned that that's going to ever happen.
But could I challenge you on that,
Please
actually,
do.
Graham? I don't think that's a personality thing or a person thing. I think that's a workload thing. I think that's, oh my God, all of the things that are on my plate are already, they got me to 120%. And now you come 3 weeks before the end of the quarter and tell me you need me for 2 days this week. I just cannot do that. And that's when it becomes transactional, I think. So I think personally, at least that's the way I've experienced it. It's not that people can't or are unwilling. It's just, it's a protection mechanism, actually, to go, I cannot even think about your thing. I have so many things on my plate.
The analogy, I love that point because the analogy I use is like when there's been some kind of disaster in your hometown and like all the neighbors come out and help each other. Like I was in New York during 9/11 and it was people helping anyone on the street, like anything that you need, like anyone comes out of their shell to help. And even, you see these pictures of, 1,000 people pulling rocks out of something, right? Like we're good as a general species. We can mobilize in, or that's a very extreme example, but you also see like, I don't know, you see when people are planning a trip and there's all sorts of people and they really need to get down to brass tacks and collaborate with each other. One, there is a lot of cognitive load involved in that because these are people you don't collaborate with a lot. So you need to reset with them. It takes a little bit to get to know what they're doing. Also, to your point, it's so much different when the team is like, yeah, we'll do. I made this funny example the other day where it's like, hey, Graham, I just need this thing from you too. And you're like, yeah, I want to help you out. Let me just kind of talk to my manager or whatever. You talk to your manager and say, that other team's asking for things. I just want to help them. Now your manager's like, oh, okay, that's great. Cool. Yeah. How much time is that? That's not going to take away from any of our stuff, right? And the person's like, well, maybe, no, maybe. And then there's like, well, I just need you to go and talk to the VP because it could, but from my understanding of the company's strategy, legitimately their thing is more important right now than what we're doing. And they're like, oh yeah, 3 months ago when you had that like personal OKR for your promo package, I really do think we need to get both things done, right? Or one thing. And so, you learn enough times that if you start to so what you see in organizations is either tons of helping that doesn't get acknowledged, tons, or tons of ignoring that just goes as acceptable behavior within the company. I just didn't get back to them. My thing is more important. Or the opposite is like, oh yeah, no, I mean, they don't say they've been spending 30% of their time helping people. And in my experience, I've met both in both environments, but it's incredible actually how much people help other people on the DL in many occasions. But I can see it working both of these particular ways. It's maybe actually even a fascinating point for people to think about what is the default response in the org that you're working with, or even within the organization you're working with, because from an operations standpoint, it would help you understand the psychology of why people are just ignoring you, or why people are ignoring each other, or why they say they're ignoring each other, but behind the scenes, they're helping each other all the time. So it's kind of fascinating.
It's really very interesting. And both of you made great points. And Tony, just to reflect back on what you said, yeah, absolutely. I think that, workloads are a huge part of the reason behind it. I'd kind of still maintain but it's still a behavioral thing. It's a response to that. And John, using your analogy ever so slightly, you were talking about kind of 9/11 and things like that, almost certainly, in fact, I am very certain there will have also been so many people that were in fight or flight mode with that as well.
Yeah.
And so, for all of the great people that absolutely would have helped out, there will have been people that have just been like, no, I'm going to go away.
I'm out. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, and rightly so, there's absolutely no casting any opinions on it about at all, but kind of bringing it back away from 9/11. Weirdly, I never thought we'd talk about that on this podcast. There is a big behaviour thing. There's a big psychology thing here, and I realised only recently that I spend an inordinate amount of time unpicking why people have made decisions, why people
Yeah.
have said X, Y, and Z, why people, have not got back to or got back to somebody, why we have got into this situation, why we have got into a position of actually, almost, butting heads on a decision of a way of thinking or something like that. And I think as we've all kind of got to say, actually stepping back, unpicking a little bit, what was the core reason why this started in the first place? And I genuinely think that is a big part of what we do in product operations and in many type of roles is actually, look, we do genuinely as you said earlier, John, as a species, we want to be helpful. We want to be collaborative. We are a community-based species, absolutely. And as part of that is to build a good community together. But there's so much that gets in the way of that. And I think what we end up doing is kind of sort of going, well, I'm not solving that problem. I want to solve that problem right back over there from the very start so that actually we've not got to where we are now.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about what you said, and it's been sort of a shift in my thinking a little bit in my career, is that I do think that everyone should dip their head into the why question. They should think about the why. But I've become a really big there's a great book called Talk to the Elephant, which is like a behavior design book. I really, really like the book. It's by Julie Dirksen. And there's also some of the later writings of Ralph Stacey, who wrote a lot about complexity, has this whole theory around it calls interactional beliefs around complexity, which is like that we're largely a function of our interactions with each other to do these things. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is, if I'm amazed when you go to a team and you say to them, okay, I heard you want to be more empowered or something. And you say like, well, what would we actually observe? Like, what's the behavior that what would it look like to me if I just walked in here? And they're like, well, we'd be more empowered. It would be like, no, what specifically would it look like? And a great example of this is someone the other day had a great answer. Said, okay, this meeting, we spend 90% of that meeting talking about delivery. I expect that we will always be talking about delivery, but I think we would change our behavior in that particular meeting where the percentage would shift a little bit to be like 50-50 delivery and then insights and outcomes that we had. And we would observe this, and we would observe people talking about, and they gave a very vivid example. What struck me about what you said is I think a lot of people should spend more time asking why they're doing it. As someone who asks why a lot and walks around with a big, like I have an eternal question mark on my head. One of the big shifts in my thinking was like, you know what? Even if I figured out why, it wouldn't necessarily in this complex environment help me think about how to nudge things forward. And sometimes it's better to drift out of as a counterpoint to what you're saying, as a balance to what you're saying. It's sometimes better to just imagine like you can act your way into new mindsets, and teams can act their way into new mindsets without necessarily, you might have 15 reasons why in your company. And the founders are like this, that this is like this, these other people are like this. And from a product it sounds kind of slimy to talk about behavior design. And I guess people don't think about it, but just from a core thing, it's not changing unless the atoms are changing. So I often say to people like, well, what would the atoms do differently? Like, besides just talking to us what we think would happen or whatever, like what's going to happen? And it's a pretty liberating way to think about it, where you should dip into, I use this thing called the just the button that can, which is there's always the justers who are like, well, we just need to empower the teams, right? But on the flip side, there's always that person. And sometimes it's the same person who's like, but I don't know about the context here, but we're in Europe, and like, but I don't know about this, and like, but I don't know about why this happens this way, but did you think about this, but did you think about that? And you got the justers and the butters. And so this sort of philosophy I've had lately is this canning philosophy, which is like, while acknowledging the complexity of the situation and not oversimplifying the situation, both of those things, how can we create like a point of leverage? What can we do?
Yeah.
Like how can we behave our way into some new thing? So you just kind of sparked that idea. It's kind of like in my mind, it's been the more like balanced approach in my head, where I'd either get caught. And one of the other funny things is a lot of the people who talk about better ways of working are the worst justers. And I catch myself being a juster. Like we just need to take a holistic approach. Ironically, that's justing. that's justing, right? A lot of people don't want to take a holistic approach. They just want their day to go better tomorrow, right? So anyway, some more philosophical thoughts to think about ending with.
No, I love that. And it's funny because I actually use that a lot when creating a product ops strategy, either with my coachees or with clients. Imagine the behaviors in your organization 3 years from now, 5 years from now, Oh, I want us to get together and speak about the experiments we're running every week. Fantastic. Now, what's the delta between there and here in relation to tooling, knowledge, right? But also behaviors, right? You need to foster that. And then what is the smallest step you can take this month to get us closer to that sort of ideal behavior? But I love this idea of, the atom kind of making up the whole, because you absolutely do need both.
Yeah. And there's this push-pull between these kind of aspirations. I mean, I'm so happy that people are out there talking about the way things should be. This is this product operating model, or this is all these things. Like, you need those people out there, but you also need the people who are just like, how are the atoms going to change right here? I've heard the rah, rah, rah speech, it was good. I gave the book to leadership. They think it's simple. We just need to bring in people who've done it before, and we're going to be fine. Those people fail, by the way, like after they come from big tech to these companies, which is kind of funny. But there's a whole other world of that, which is like, how are we going to just do the thing? Like, what can we do right now? It's the balance in all this thinking. You need that aspirational future backwards kind of look, but then you also need the like, what's in the reality right now kind of view as well.
Yeah. And I think we're back to the builders and the wranglers, right? And the designers and operational excellence. Like that kind of encompasses almost all the skills you need to get those things over the line then.
Yeah. I've absolutely loved this conversation, and I don't want it to end. I'm obviously very conscious that we are almost out of time. But John, I'd love to just give you a few minutes to talk a little bit more about what you're doing at Dotwork now, because you and I have had at least one conversation on this a couple of months ago, and would really just love to know and share with the audience a little bit more about what you're working on.
Yeah, I can share a bit. I guess the general observation that we've had is that there's like a lot of pretty good frontline tools, like frontline road mapping or frontline collaboration, obviously, like Jira. There's a lot of frontline tools. And there's, stuff a little bit around the commercialization side of things, at least some kind of like routing of stuff. There's a little bit of stuff around how to get feedback to the teams. There's kind of this evolved, if you look in the industry, this sort of idea to release flow. Like, we'll have roadmaps, we'll put the ideas on one side, and then we'll vet the ideas, and then out the other side will come stuff, and maybe we'll share those roadmaps with our partners internally that's doing it. But the general observation was that there is a whole class of problems that sit above that's just sitting in spreadsheets and sitting in decks and sitting in no-code tools that sometimes are cracking and breaking, that's sitting in people's heads. And those would be like the executive UBRs or QBRs. There's a lot of stuff around how strategy gets communicated. There's the stuff around what finance is doing and how to think about teams as they do this stuff. And it's just in most companies, people are forced to pick the best, worst tools. Like, there's no things that get people super excited about that type of work and to do those things. And so that's generally where we're focusing. One of the things that's interesting in my mind, it's very meta, but what we're doing with our design and launch partnerships is almost serving as an external product ops building team for our customers. Now, this would normally seem crazy. I love doing things that would normally seem crazy to me. Like, if you had said 5 years ago, oh, you're going to do a company and you're going to go to market, or at least you're going to start to ramp up by literally like we do these things called napkin sprints with customers, where we just like, if you can draw it on a napkin, we get back to you in a day or two, and like, it's in the product. And so you get these leaders being like, I've always liked this one view, but why can't we see goals alongside it? Or I've always liked this one thing, and we just crank it out. But what we're doing behind the scenes, very transparently, is we've built out a sort of platform and a whole library of like widgets and things like that. So it's actually, we're almost playing the builder. And the vision is that if we can, we actually have a metric, which is basically we call regrettable engineering. And the idea is that like every time we do one of these napkin sprints, if we find ourselves having to like work around our platform or do things that aren't part of the configuration, that's called regrettable engineering. And our North Star is to basically bring that down to zero. So you could think of it like, because people right now in SaaS, they want solutions, not subscriptions. People don't want to be in the tools. People want to be where they want to be. They don't want to be entering data by hand in these particular things. They want the solution. And so, it's just fascinating to me. You'll talk to people, be like, oh, we're worried about this $40,000 spend on this tool. And then you're like, well, how much time do you all spend on annual planning and quarterly planning? Oh, about 10% of all the salaries. So if the company is like a $5 billion company and spends 20% of their time, 20% of their money on R&D, and then 20% of that and 10% of that goes to stuff, they're spending tens of millions of dollars of people's time. But so that's like such an amazing opportunity. Like why those things should go very, very smoothly. Those rituals should go very, very smoothly and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of generally the space that we're playing. It's really, really interesting. So like strategy deployment and strategic goals and understanding allocation in reasonable, sane ways versus the perverse ways, all that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff we're working on.
Wow. And Antonia, before we finish, anything you want to say to any of that?
No, I'm super excited about it. I think it's something that will also supercharge product ops folks, right? And the people wearing the product ops hats in organizations where there is no product ops, right? So really, really interesting stuff. I'm personally, selfishly, especially interested in the interconnect between, high level strategy, taking that into the teams, but then also with this financial lens, because I think that is one of the hardest things to do, is one of the hardest nuts to crack. So I'm really excited.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, one of the things is just that people get mad at tools, but tools, went back to that discussion of what needs to be, there are many contextual signifiers and things, but there are operational and investment type signifiers and categories that really do help to reinforce. The problem is that people are sort of forced into these perverse ways of thinking about it, like, oh, developers, you spend 11% on that, or did you do anything like that? Much more important, for example, is to formalize maybe the funding structure for teams. Teams are at different stages of growth of the area that they are in, might want to create a different relationship with finance. Some is funding based on, like, there's some teams in some companies where you don't even really need to look at their roadmap. I mean, you need to know what they're going to launch and what they're going to release, but they're dialed in. They've got a handful of metrics they're moving. You don't even need to, you just say, well, what's that team's mission and vision, and like, what are their actionable inputs they're moving, and everything's in your mind. You don't need to worry too much about it. And you can fund because for the foreseeable future, they're going to just be hill climbing up a metric over time. However, when you're early on, you're going to dip and you need different investment. And when you're later on, you slow down, and then you have to decide whether to double down to keep going up the hill or to like control it. So one of the things that's just fascinating, the finance thing, is just agreeing that there's a couple different funding models.
Right.
And then having that represented even in basic ways in the tools that you use so that you apply the right approach and it's more formalized can be like a complete game changer for companies. Or even just, acknowledging that different teams have different, what they call like, topologies or whatever, can be a huge game changer. So yeah, that's like some of the key to the finance interlock is creating a game that's actually finance people. They buy companies. They don't, it's not a foreign idea in finance to go out and invest in a company for outcomes. That's not a weird idea to them. And yet often product teams are kind of like, they slip into this sort of project-based funding or very near-term ROI type funding because they haven't established the right game with finance and explained the game for that team, or they're trying to monoprocess across the company, which is the big anti-pattern, where if you just take the average motion of a team and you think, what's the right way to fund that team, you'll end up with something crappy. But if you say, like, this team is in growth mode, this team is in optimization mode, this team's in margin optimization mode, this team is in startup mode, we're going to fund that like a startup, We're going to fund that based on their metrics. And you know what? Maybe we're going to fund that one based on the big projects that they build. Like that team is just in delivery mode. That would be like a huge game changer for a lot of companies, just to acknowledge that.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, we'll build your dream view. Antonia, you just come to us, like we'll sort it out. I've never thought I'd say that at the air, but it feels so dirty of me saying that, but I actually do believe in our approach.
I love it.
Well, I mean, there's that whole, even starting on that conversation, we could have a whole podcast about that, about how, the idea of not only funding teams, but actually the one stage further than that, the mentality of those teams and shifting that mindset of those teams to say, what mode are you in at a particular time that isn't, it's a fluid thing. It's not something that's always how you're going to work. We could get on to huge amounts with there. But unfortunately, John, we've run out of time today. Which
I have a stand up that I'm late for. I'm back in the realm, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's Friday afternoon for all of us here as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Really great. Thank you, as always, to my co-host, Antonia Landi, and John, our absolutely special guest today, John Cutler. Thank you so, so much. Please do connect with any of us on LinkedIn, as ever, to our friends, Product-Led Alliance, who facilitate this ongoing series, do all the editing, etc., etc. Thank you very much as well. And thank you to everybody watching as well. I'm going to go have a lie down now because my brain has just exploded with all of this stuff. But thank you to everybody watching, and we look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of the Product Ops Chronicles. Thank you, everybody.